Warning, spoiler alert, spoiler alert. Hello everybody and welcome to the Derek Ruby Show. I am your host, the previously mentioned Mr. Ruby, and this is Halloween month here on the Derek Ruby Show. And you can't really have a Halloween month without Freddy Krueger, so this is my review of A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors. The movie opens with a quote from Edgar Allan Poe. We see what looks like somebody baking something, and it seems like every horror movie has a fly for symbolism. This is Kristen. She's actually building a model house, and she's trying to do whatever she can to stay awake. She eats a spoonful of coffee, we get a little Diet Coke product placement, and then she turns on the radio and blasts some 80s music because it is an 80s movie. Now her mom shows up and makes her turn the radio off and go to bed, and shows us that she doesn't necessarily have the best parenting skills either.
Honey, I've got a guest.
And you don't want to keep him waiting.
That's right, I don't.
Yeah, she's kind of a bitch. So we go right into our dream sequence, and we end up at that familiar looking house with that familiar nursery rhyme.
7, 8, stay up late. 9, 10, again.
We see a little girl on the tricycle, and Kristen asks,
What is this place?
The little girl goes inside and Kristen follows, and I really have to praise this sequence because right off the bat, it is very reminiscent of the first movie. It's not only trying to recapture the spirit of the opening of the original Nightmare, but it does it very well. She follows the little girl down the stairs and then she tells her that Freddy's home. So Kristen picks the little girl up and then we are on to our chase scene. And it's not too long before we actually get to see Freddy. We see all these dead bodies hanging and Kristen wakes up from her dream. Then she goes into the bathroom a little dazed and confused. And then...
Kristen!
I really have to take a minute to just praise the opening sequence of this movie. It was done very brilliantly. Now we see an orderly at a psychiatric hospital named Max, who starts to have a conversation with Dr. Neil Gordon. Just some basic character introductions. Dr. Gordon is told by Dr. Elizabeth that a new doctor will be there named Nancy, and he's very resistant to this idea. Kristen starts screaming in another room and she's refusing to get sedated and put back to sleep. Dr. Neil tries to calm her down, but it doesn't work. As Kristen starts saying the famous nursery rhyme,
9, 10, never sleep again. Where did you learn that rhyme?
less than a minute on the job and Nancy's way overqualified since she's better than everybody else at it. Nancy and Neil have a conversation about the kids at the psychiatric hospital. Nancy drops her purse, Neil helps her pick up the contents, and he sees that she has a bottle of Hypno-Seal. So they say their goodbyes and Neil notices a nun just blatantly staring at him. If that were me, I'd feel very awkward. Especially since she just vanishes in an instant. Max introduces Nancy to some of the patients. First we meet Philip. He's very much into puppetry. And this is Kincaid. He's pretty much a troublemaker. We also meet Joey, who can't speak, and he's very attracted to Nurse Marcy. And this is Lorenzo. He's pretty much a scumbag. And you'll see why later. Nancy talks to Kristen's mom and tries to ask her some questions that could possibly help her get to the bottom of her problems. But Kristen's mom displays excellent parenting skills by saying,
Look, I'm sorry to hear that, but you're the experts on this, not me. If I had any insight into any of this, I would share them with you. Believe me.
Like I said, she's a total bitch and just really can't seem to help her daughter in any kind of way. Nancy goes up to Kristen's room and she sees the house that she was working on. And it brings back a lot of memories for her because that is the house that she used to live in. Neil researches what Hypno-Seal is and all of its side effects. Kristen falls asleep and she sees tricycle tracks. And before we know it, we're in another dream sequence. She walks into a room and sees a rotting pig on the table. Now, like I said, these dream sequences are really good and reminiscent of the first Nightmare. You can tell that they had a much bigger budget than the first two movies. Electricity is popping everywhere, the floor is rumbling, and when we least suspect it, Kristen calls for Nancy and pulls her into her dream, and the effects still hold up.
Oh my God.
So they run and shut the door on Freddy, and they wake right up. And this is really awesome. Heather Langenkamp has always done a good job of playing Nancy. Her character has always been portrayed as being really strong. The first time that she sees Freddy, she's right back on the attack. And that little nod to the first movie where Freddy looks at her and says, "You," really adds a consistency that a lot of other horror movies are lacking. So the next day, Nancy brings the house into Kristen and tells her that she used to live in it. And we establish that Kristen has a power and she can bring other people into her dreams. Then Nancy gives it to her straight about Freddy Krueger.
He's real.
We have a group therapy session, which is another way for the movie to establish more introductions. But at least it does spread them out and they don't feel forced. We have Will, who's in a wheelchair, Jennifer, who's going to be a TV star someday, and Taryn, who's a drug addict. Philip makes a speech about everything that's going on, and Elizabeth replies,
"The byproducts of guilt. Psychological scars stemming from moral conflicts and overt sexuality."
Oh, great. Nance, my dick is killing me.
You know, Kincaid should have been a stand-up comedian. So Taryn, Will, and Philip are playing D&D, and then they're told to go to bed. Why D&D? Because it's the 80s. Joey and Will take shifts to stay awake and keep each other from being upset in their dreams. Then we see Nancy and Neil out to dinner, and Nancy tries to talk Neil into using other methods. Neil brings up the hypnoseal, and he is completely against it. We go to Kincaid and Philip's room, and we get an awesome claymation scene. And I honestly believe when people think of Freddy Krueger, this scene does come to mind. We see Philip walking around ironically like a puppet, and I honestly have to say, even though this is the 1980s, I feel the effects look really good here. It's pretty funny that the nurse on duty doesn't see him walking by at all, even though he takes his sweet time across the hallway. But every time we go back to Philip's perspective, it's pretty creepy. Joey looks out the window and he sees that Philip's about to jump. He then runs and wakes up Will, and he does everything he can to get everybody's attention. He alerts the nurse up front, he bangs down the hallway, and everybody runs to the bedroom. The entire gang is screaming at the top of their lungs out the busted window, just trying to get Philip to wake up. Unfortunately, though, so they have a group therapy session to talk about what happened the night before, and Dr. Elizabeth decides that they're going to use extreme methods.
We'll start a policy of evening sedation for everybody.
The fuck you will! Anybody tries drugs on me, get his ass kicked!
Then Dr. Gordon and Dr. Elizabeth argue, and he tells her that they're going to prescribe them hypnoseal. So she washes her hands of the situation and says that he's going to be solely responsible. So Jennifer is watching TV, and Max tells her that she needs to go to bed. But she begs Max to let her stay up because of what happened the night before, and Max agrees. Then we see Lorenzo talking to Taryn, and he offers her drugs in exchange for...
I am talking clean pharmaceutical high, a night at Club Meth.
I don't do that shit.
Yeah? What are those, beauty marks?
Those are ancient history.
Oh, yeah? Well, if you're ever in the mood for a history lesson, I'm your teacher, understand?
Man, this guy is such a scumbag. Does he die? No. Of all the people in this movie that you should want to die, this guy just gets a free pass and he doesn't. What the fuck is wrong with you, movie? So Jennifer is watching Zsa Zsa Gabor on TV, and...
Can I ask you something?
Certainly.
Who gives a fuck what you think?
So Jennifer walks up to the TV and starts hitting it, and then...
Jennifer, your big break in TV. Welcome to prime time, bitch.
This is one of the most iconic scenes in not just the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, but all horror movies. Most killers in slasher movies don't talk, but since Freddy does, he really doesn't have much competition in this area. And not only is the line tremendous, but it was all ad-libbed by Robert Englund, which just shows his range as an actor and just feeling the moment. And chances are, if you've watched this film before, this is probably the number one thing you think of when you think of Freddy Krueger, besides the glove. Neil is at Jennifer's funeral and he starts talking to the nun from earlier, and she reveals,
"Only one thing can save the children. The unquiet spirit must be laid to rest. It is an abomination to God and to man."
Nancy walks up and asks him who he was talking to, and the nun has mysteriously disappeared again. Nancy and Neil have a private dinner and they talk about all the incidents, and Nancy assures him that he's doing the best that he can. And then she talks him into using a different method. So the next day they have a meeting and Nancy reveals to all the kids,
"His name is Freddy Krueger. He was a child murderer before he died. And after he died, well, he became something worse. 6 years ago, he killed my friends, your parents, my parents. They burned him alive, and now we're paying for their sins. You are the last of the Elm Street children."
So they decide to use Kristen's power and all attempt to go to sleep. Unfortunately, it doesn't work, so they decide to take a break. Joey looks out into the hallway and he sees the hot nurse Marcy, and he decides to follow her down the hallway. She calls Joey into the room and then proceeds to tell him how much that she likes him and that she's always making excuses just to see him. In the meantime, everybody else realizes that they are in a dream and they begin to show off their dream powers. Will is a wizard, Kristen's a gymnast, Kincaid is super strong, and Taryn is beautiful and dangerous. Nurse Marcy comes on to Joey and finally gives him what he always wanted. The others realize that Joey's missing, but then the walls start to burn and close in. And the effects here look really good. I can't praise this movie enough for the atmosphere that it tries to create with its dream world. But just when things start to look bad for our characters, Nurse Elizabeth shows up and inadvertently saves the day. So as a result of the group therapy session, Joey is in a coma. Nurse Elizabeth rats out Neil to the head of the department, and in turn him and Nancy are fired. Just as Neil is taking his stuff and about to leave, he notices the nun in a closed-off wing of the hospital, and he goes in there to go talk to her. He climbs up the stairs and it takes him a minute to find her, but when he does, the sister reveals to him,
"The young girl on the staff was accidentally locked in here over the holidays. She was raped hundreds of times. When they found her, she was barely alive and with child. That girl was Amanda Krueger. Her child, Freddy, the bastard son of 100 maniacs. You must find the remains and bury him in hallowed ground."
Now, when it comes to killers like Michael and Jason, I've never wanted too much backstory. Because Freddy is a talking slasher and he has a personality, I actually find this backstory okay. It gives you just a little bit, but not too much. Then Freddy sends Nancy a message on Joey's body, and again, for the effects of an older movie like this, it actually holds up pretty well. Nancy and Neil discuss what they're going to do next, and they talk about where can they find Freddy's remains, and Nancy knows one person. With Nurse Elizabeth in charge, she decides to take the hypnosil away from everybody, and Kristen doesn't react to this news very well. The result of this is Kristen gets thrown in a padded cell. So Nancy and Neil go to the bar and they visit her dad from the first movie, Lieutenant Thompson. And it's nice that they keep with the continuity of the original film. And if you've watched my reviews before, you know I love continuity. Nancy asks her dad where Freddy's remains are buried, but he refuses to help her. Taryn pages Neil and she tells him what happened to Kristen. So Nancy leaves and heads off to the hospital. Then Neil goes up to Lieutenant Thompson and says,
"My name is Neil Gordon. Pleased to meet you. There now, we've met! Now listen to me! I don't know if you care whether Nancy lives or dies, but I do! You and I are going on a little scavenger hunt."
Neil stops off at the church so he can fill a bottle up with holy water, and he takes a cross. Nancy makes it to the hospital and she tries to see Kristen. But Max doesn't completely trust Nancy and he won't let her through. So she begs him to let her see the kids and say goodbye. And he reluctantly agrees. So she reunites with her patients and they go off to have a group session. Nancy and the kids start their group sleep session. And just like that, they're reunited with Kristen. And everybody is happy to see each other. Kristen wakes back up in her room and her mom is telling her to go to bed. It's a complete deja vu at the beginning of the movie. Kristen seems confused, but she gives her mom a hug. Then her mom puts her down to sleep and...
I said, where's the fucking bourbon? You should listen to your mother.
God damn it, Kristen, you ruin everything. Every time I bring a man home, you spoil it. You know what your shrink says? You're just trying to get a little attention.
See, I told you her mom was a bitch. So the chase begins around the room, and I can't say enough good things about this scene. The whole sequence of Freddy trying to get her and her finally falling down the stairs, it really invokes what a horror movie should be all about. Kristen starts yelling for Nancy, but then Taryn hears her. She comes across Freddy, and they actually start to have a knife fight. Taryn actually gets the best of Freddy and does surprisingly well, but... It's a good message, children. Drugs are bad. Then we see Will in this dark hallway, and the cinematography here is excellent. It's got the perfect lighting and that horror atmosphere that you come to love from a lot of your favorite films. Then Freddy shows up and he starts taunting him about being disabled and tries to run him over with a demonic-looking wheelchair. But Will is able to fight back and he's on the attack.
In the name of Lorik, Prince of Elves, demon be gone!
Sorry, kid. I don't believe in fairy tales.
Come on, Will. Don't you know that a wizard is not very good in close combat? I mean, it's like D&D 101. You were hurting him from a distance, why would you run right up to him? Kristen and Nancy meet up, and they're so happy to see each other. Then Kincaid shows up, and he calls out Freddy. Then a floating door shows up, and of course, they go in. Lieutenant Thompson and Neil go into the junkyard, and they find Freddy's remains. And after a little bit of discussion, they attempt to bury his body. So Nancy and the group find Joey, and as Freddy's going to release him into the fiery pits of hell, Nancy rushes in like her character always does. Kristen and Kincaid try to fight Freddy, but Nancy deals what she believes to be a killing blow. But then she realizes...
He's strong! He's never been this strong!
Yes. The souls of the children. Give me strength.
The effects here of the whole souls of the children thing is a little dated, but it's creepy nonetheless. Freddy leaves to go stop his funeral, and the entire junkyard just goes apeshit. Cars are honking their horns, engines are making noise. Freddy's corpse starts fighting Neil and Lieutenant Thompson, and this thing looks very dated. It's like Terminator 1 CG, but really bad. Then Freddy buries Neil like he was Triple H in the early 2000s, burying the entire WWE roster. Nancy and the gang go to a room full of mirrors, and now Freddy's back, and he starts pulling every one of them through one of the mirrors. It's a very captivating scene and done very well. It shows off the range of what Freddy can do with his dream powers. Joey is hiding in the corner of the room, and then... So they think that's all it took and this whole ordeal must be over. Then Nancy's dad comes to her and he tells her that he crossed over, and we get a very touching moment between her and her father. Neil manages to wake up and Freddy goes after Kristen, but Nancy just won't die. Neil buries the body and drops the holy water, getting rid of Krueger forever. Or so we think. And I have to say, if this would have been the last movie, it would have been a good wrap-up to the entire story. Unfortunately, Nancy dies, and that's really a shame, because Heather Langenkamp pretty much has proven that between her and Robert Englund, she carries these movies. And we would have 3 more films go by before she returns in Wes Craven's New Nightmare. During Nancy's funeral, Neil sees the nun and he follows her to a gravestone. And then we get the big reveal that the nun was the dead spirit of Freddy's mother the entire time. Then the final scene in the movie has Neil sleeping. And that's how our movie ends. So Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors, what do I think about it? For a movie that came out in 1987, it surprisingly holds up really well. I praised the special effects throughout the entire film, and most of them are really good. This is the sequel to the original Nightmare on Elm Street that everybody wanted, and it does a really good job of being an excellent companion piece to that first film. And I think a lot of this has to do with Heather Langenkamp's character of Nancy Thompson. She is one of the greatest heroines in the entire slasher genre. In the first movie, she didn't just take it, she fought Freddy. In this movie, the very first thing she does when she sees Freddy is stab him right in the eye. And Robert Englund does an amazing job playing Freddy like he always did. I would say when a lot of people think of Freddy Krueger, they think of this movie. It still has that horror vibe like the first one did, but it also has that wisecracking Freddy that we come to know in later movies, but it's the perfect blend of the two. All the other actors put on pretty strong performances too. Patricia Arquette as Kristen does an amazing job. The cinematography is great, and the movie does put off that horror atmosphere that you want when you see a slasher film. It's a little bit more over the top than the original, but it works just fine. I understand why a lot of people feel that this is their favorite movie in the franchise. But it does have some minor problems. The plot is pretty solid, but that scene with that scumbag Lorenzo had no purpose being there. We already knew Taryn was a drug addict, and I don't understand why this movie wouldn't have this guy have a painful death. It's very uncharacteristic of a slasher film. Normally assholes get theirs. So that's a pretty good nitpick that I find with this film. Plus, when you look at the skeleton effects, they're very dated, and even some of the sound effects that were taking place in the junkyard scene. Overall, though, I would have to recommend this film. Even if you're just a casual horror fan, this is one you should definitely put in your collection. So I'm going to have to give A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors 4.5 stars. So thank you guys for watching the Derek Ruby Show, and I hope you're enjoying our Halloween month. We still have quite a few more horror movies to go before the month is finished, so I hope you guys will stick around. Don't forget to stay for the extra credit scene, and with that said, you can follow me on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, and Instagram. And as always, have a good one. And I'll see you guys next time. Yeah, she's kind of a bitch. Like I said, she's a total bitch. See? I told you her mom was a bitch.
Welcome to prime time, bitch!